my son called me, angrily demanding $75,000, and his wife stood beside him waiting for my answer. I smiled and said, "Of course." 6 hours later, they arrived at my house and found only an envelope. When they opened it, both of them went completely silent. I told my son, of course I would give him $75,000. And I want you to know that by the time I said those words, I had already spent 6 hours making absolutely sure he would never see a dime of it. My name is Gary Holbrook. I am 63 years old, and I spent 31 years as a commercial property manager here in Omaha, Nebraska, running maintenance crews and lease negotiations for 4 shopping plazas on the west side of the city. I retired 18 months ago. My wife Sandra says retirement mostly means I now have opinions about the sprinkler timer and stronger ones about the neighbor's leaf blower. Sandra and I have been married 34 years. I was 29 when we got married. She was 27. We built a life on Fontanelle Boulevard that I was proud of, right up until the day my own son decided my signature was something he could just borrow. Sandra is 61, sharp as a tack, and she has never once let me finish a sentence she didn't agree with. She ran the front desk at a pediatric clinic for 2 decades, and she can read a lie off a person's face faster than any lawyer I've ever met. My best friend Roy Delaney and I have known each other since 1987, when we worked the same loading dock at a wholesale supplier out on L Street. Roy is 64 now, retired from the same company, and he still calls me every Sunday morning to argue about the Huskers before either of us has had coffee. He has never once let a phone call from me go to voicemail, not in almost 40 years. That matters more to this story than you might think right now. Our son Bradley is 33 years old. He's a loan officer at a regional bank branch off Dodge Street. Been there almost 9 years, worked his way up from teller. He married Nicole 6 years ago, and they bought a house in Elkhorn that was, from the very beginning, more house than either of them could comfortably afford on a loan officer's salary and a hospital lab income. I never said that to his face. Sandra said it to his face plenty, usually right after Thanksgiving dinner, when she'd had enough wine to be honest about it. The warning signs started small, the way they always do. Around March, Bradley mentioned they were thinking of turning their basement into a short-term rental, one of those Airbnb setups. Said a coworker was clearing an extra $1,400 a month doing it. I told him it sounded like a lot of permitting headaches for not much return, and he laughed it off, said I was old-fashioned about money. In April, he asked if we'd co-sign something for a small business loan, some kind of property management side venture. I said I'd think about it, then never heard about it again, which should have told me something right there. In May, Nicole stopped coming to Sunday dinners. Always some excuse about her shift schedule at the hospital lab. Bradley got thinner. He got quieter at family gatherings, the kind of quiet where a man is doing math in his head instead of talking to you. In early June, he mentioned, just in passing, that Elkhorn property taxes had gone up again and it was killing them. I noticed all of it. I didn't act on any of it, because he's my son, and you give your children room to struggle before you assume the worst of them. On June 2nd, a letter arrived at our house from Cornhusker State Bank, addressed to me, forwarded from a P.O. box we hadn't used in 6 years because apparently we were still on some outdated mailing list nobody had cleaned up. It was a statement for a home equity line of credit. $75,000, drawn against our house on Fontanelle Boulevard. I stood in the kitchen holding that piece of paper and read the account number twice, because I did not open a HELOC. I have never applied for a HELOC in my life. I didn't call Bradley. I got in my truck and drove to the Dodge Street branch myself, the same branch where my son works, and asked to speak to a manager. Not to him. A woman named Carla Whitfield pulled the file. She went quiet reading it, the kind of quiet that tells you something before anyone says a word. She asked me to wait in her office and came back a few minutes later with a compliance supervisor. The application had my name, my social security number, and a signature close enough to fool an untrained eye, but not close enough to fool 34 years of paying our own mortgage bills together. The origination had been processed on a Thursday afternoon in late May, logged under a terminal that had been left open during a lunch coverage shift. The login belonged to a coworker of Bradley's who'd stepped away and hadn't locked her screen. The supervisor pulled the internal access log without me even asking twice. Bradley had covered that desk that exact hour. It was right there in black and white, time-stamped. I sat in that little office with the air conditioning humming too loud, and I read that timestamp 3 times. My hands went still on the arms of the chair. Carla asked if I was all right. Gary, give me a minute. And I meant it, because I needed one. That night, I called Roy. He answered on the second ring, like he always does. Roy, Gary, it's 10:30. Somebody die? Gary, worse. Bradley forged my signature on a home equity loan for $75,000 against my house. A long silence. Roy, say that again. Slower. I said it again. Slower. Roy exhaled hard. Roy, Gary, I love that boy. I watched him grow up. I taught him to drive stick in my own driveway. But you cannot let this slide just because he's your son. If you handle this quiet and forgive it quiet, he learns nothing. And Sandra loses her house right along with you. Gary, I know. Roy, you need a lawyer before you need a father. That's the hard truth of it. Call one tomorrow morning, first thing. I hung up feeling lighter. The way you always do after Roy tells you something true instead of something comfortable. The next morning, I called Denise Calloway, a lawyer Roy had used for his own small business years back. Denise is direct, dry, and does not waste a single word on comfort you haven't earned. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting once, then said, Denise, Gary, this is forgery, and it's also bank fraud, because the instrument passed through a federally insured institution. We are not talking about a family dispute anymore. We are talking about real criminal exposure for him. Gary, I don't want him in prison. I want the house protected, and I want this stopped. Denise, then we do it in the right order, and we do it fast. First, we file a fraud dispute with the bank's back office to freeze and void the account before another dollar moves. Second, we file a police report, because if we don't, the bank's own fraud investigators will start wondering whether you're covering for him, and that puts you in a worse legal position than him. Third, you sign a formal notarized letter revoking any financial authority he has ever claimed, real or otherwise, on any account tied to your name. We spent 6 hours on it, start to finish. Denise called the bank's fraud division at 9 o'clock that morning and had the HELOC frozen by 11 o'clock. We filed the police report with the Omaha Police Department at 1 o'clock, and Officer Reyes taking the full statement, noting the terminal log and the timestamp as the key evidence. By 3 o'clock, Denise had the notarized revocation letter drafted and signed at her office. By 4:30, Cornhusker State Bank had already placed Bradley on administrative leave pending their own internal investigation, entirely separate from the police report, which none of us had expected to move that fast. At 5 o'clock, my phone rang. Bradley, furious, saying he needed me to wire him $75,000 today, that Nicole was standing right there next to him, that they were behind on the Elkhorn mortgage, and this was the only way to stop the bank from coming after their own house. Gary, of course, Bradley. Let me get things in order. Bradley, thank you, Dad. I could hear something in his voice loosen, like a weight had lifted off him. I hung up, and Sandra looked at me across the kitchen table. Sandra, you just lied to our son. Gary, no. I told him I'd get things in order. I already have. 6 hours after that phone call, at 11 that night, Bradley and Nicole pulled into our driveway expecting cash, or at least a conversation about cash. Sandra and I weren't home. Roy was sitting on our porch swing like he owned the place, which is exactly what I'd asked him to do. On the door was an envelope with Bradley's name on it. Roy told me later that Bradley tore it open right there under the porch light. Inside was a copy of the police report, a copy of the bank's fraud freeze confirmation, and Denise's revocation letter. Nicole read over his shoulder. Roy said neither one of them said a single word for almost a full minute. Bradley's hands were shaking bad enough that the papers rattled. Nicole sat down hard on the porch step, like her legs had simply stopped holding her. Roy, your father's not coming tonight. He wanted you to read that first. Bradley called me twice more that night. I let both calls go to voicemail. I let the paperwork do the talking. Denise had already set it all in motion hours earlier. Here's how it ended. Cornhusker State Bank's internal investigation confirmed the terminal log and Bradley's presence at that desk that afternoon and terminated his employment within the week. He lost his loan officer license through the Nebraska Department of Banking and Finance shortly after, since a forgery and fraud conviction bars a person from holding that license going forward. The Douglas County Attorney's Office charged him with forgery in the second degree, a Class 3 felony under Nebraska law. Given the instrument's face value of $75,000, well above the $5,000 threshold, plus bank fraud under federal statute, because the forged instrument passed through an FDIC-insured bank. He pled to the state forgery charge, receiving 3 years probation, full restitution, and a permanent professional licensing bar, with the federal count resolved through a deferred prosecution agreement tied to complete cooperation and restitution. The HELOC itself was voided entirely by the bank once fraud was confirmed. Our house was never at risk of lien or foreclosure at any point after that first phone call to Denise. Nicole moved out 4 months later. She told Sandra, quietly, over coffee at our kitchen table, that she couldn't keep building a life with someone who'd risk his own father's house without telling her the full truth of it beforehand. She and Bradley divorced the following spring, and last I heard she'd moved back to Lincoln to be closer to her sister. Bradley reached out twice after that, both times by letter, never by phone. The second letter, in October, actually apologized without a single excuse folded into it. I haven't fully forgiven him yet. I told him honesty, real honesty, takes longer to rebuild than a letter can carry. We talk now, carefully, about once a month, mostly about nothing important, which is its own kind of progress. Our finances were never actually touched. Denise's fee came to $11,200, paid entirely by us, and worth every cent of it. Sandra sleeps fine at night now. Most nights, so do I. 3 weeks after everything had settled, Sandra and I sat on that same porch swing on a Tuesday evening. She handed me a glass of iced tea. Sandra, you know, for a man who cried during Old Yeller, you handled all of that awfully calm. Gary, I saved the crying for later. Roy, from inside the house, hollered through the screen door. Roy, I heard that, Gary. And I've got video from 1994 to prove it. Sandra laughed, waved a hand toward the door like she was shooing him back inside, and turned to me with that look she gets right before she says something that ends the conversation for good. Sandra, well, at least we know the sprinkler timer isn't the only thing you can fix around here. I didn't have a single thing to say back to that. The porch light buzzed the way it always has, and somewhere down the block a dog was barking at nothing in particular. For the first time in weeks, it just felt like a regular Tuesday again.